When someone faces danger, he starts looking for God and begging for mercy, be it Lord God, Buddha, or another deity. He thinks about the one he worships and begs him for the salvation of his sinful soul. But what happens the moment God himself is in danger? One of the gods found himself in a similar unpleasant situation. He was suppressed by the majority and came under a verdict. When he woke up, he found himself in a place he had never been before. Sitting on the soft grass, he began to remember what had happened, realizing that he had died, or to be more precise, presumably dissipated. God cannot die, because this concept refers to God's creations. Being in a place unknown to himself, he tried to call up the system window, but was refused due to lack of rights. It was malfunctioning due to a conflict with the administrator. Remembering recent events, the guy thought that his divine status, throne, and faith were destroyed by force. As a result, his divinity was revoked and his powers disappeared. Despite this, his mind and knowledge remained intact. Looking around, the guy noticed someone starting to approach him. It was several people on a boat that were sailing towards him on a small body of water. Mooring to the shore, a tall man in a dark cloak and a large hat on his head appeared. Behind his back was a huge, mysterious scroll. Throwing this scroll into the air, he called the condemned guy by the name of Lee Chan-sung, addressing him as the former shadow god. After these words, he began to tell his biography out loud, from which it became clear that he was the son of an ordinary human couple from planet Earth, who was born in Korea in 2001. The cautious former gloomy god did not know who he was talking to. He continued to follow the stranger, listening to his words, which exactly described his past life. The man continued his story about the past of the punished god, where he mentioned that for unknown reasons, he was sent to the planet Arcadia in 2027, where he became a constellation that killed millions of other deities before being caught and brought to the place of execution. Looking at the guy again, the man with long hair nervously bit his lip before asking the question that was troubling him. But at the same moment, Lee Chan-sung rushed to attack. Unexpectedly for everyone present, he instantly found himself next to the man who had brought the scroll. The stranger only managed to react at the moment when he found himself, a moment before touching the hand of the fallen god. Realizing the danger, he managed to jump back, avoiding contact with the guy. Once out of range of the guy, the man took up his sword. Watching this, Lee Chan-sung's face showed no doubt that he was doing the right thing. The guy was thrown from his throne as part of a conspiracy, so as long as he was conscious, he was ready to continue the battle. Despite the lack of any weapons, he rushed into battle with his bare fists. His blow was so strong that it literally divided the reservoir into two parts. There was no point in fighting a real god, so the man with long gray hair decided to avoid direct blows. His full strength was not enough to contain the god, even though he had lost his former status. The guy continued to pursue the stranger and jumped out onto the water to continue attacking. Without any chance of a decent response, the man continued to avoid blows. Jumping into the air, he noticed that his opponent had disappeared from his line of sight using a wall of water. Looking at his opponent, the stranger began to be filled with horror. The shadow god looked like a real threat. Even though he lost his powers due to the majority verdict, he had no intention of stopping fighting. He didn't know where he ended up, but his goal was revenge on those who were to blame for what happened. Having no other choice, the man with long hair resorted to extreme measures and used the artifact. This was the divine suppressive steel. No matter what kind of god he was, these limiters would weaken him to a level of strength even lower than that of the most pitiful creatures. The embittered guy recognized this power. He had not seen them since the day of the divine judgment of punishment and hoped that once freed, he would not see them again. And yet, finding himself in a hopeless situation, he asked who he was dealing with. Having calmed the fallen god, the man apologized for the late performance and identified himself as the executioner of the underworld named Yol. The realization that this was the afterlife gave the guy a clear understanding of what was happening. The man clarified that the body of water with which he got to this place is called the River Styx. Still, Lee Chang-sung was full of questions. He mentioned that God, sent to the divine court of punishment as the ultimate punishment, loses his existence. But despite this, he even retained his sanity, which is why he asked the question about what was happening. The executioner replied that his fate was in the hands of the afterlife, since he had been under their jurisdiction from the very beginning. After these words, he offered to go on the road, promising that he would explain the details later because the master was already waiting for him. Having no choice, the guy with a murderous look followed his executioner. While in the boat, he clarified that Arcadia is completely different from the native earth of the gloomy god, saying that it belongs to the jurisdiction of the afterlife. As it turned out, in their kingdom, all people have their own life expectancy and fate, recorded in the Chronicle of Life and Death. In addition, the chronicle can only be found where it was written. Not understanding what the executioner was leading to, the guy continued to listen carefully to his story. The fact is that one of the places where the chronicles are located was lost. Searching for him without success, they even traveled past the stars, but all efforts were in vain. The gloomy god assumed that it was about his second home named Arcadia, and he was right. The man clarified that in addition to the disappearance of the chronicles, Li Chan's son became a god and created a real mess, which is why they had to put a lot of effort into bringing him to the place of punishment. Despite the rather detailed story, there was something that continued to excite Li Chang's interest. Remembering the events after the results of the divine court, he saw a schism that canceled the execution of the punishment. After this, he lost his powers and found himself in the afterlife. Remembering those events, the guy asked why they did it. He believed that if the executioner and his master allowed him to disperse on the other side, they would benefit themselves. The man agreed with his assumption, but clarified that it was an order from above. The decision to save the life of the fallen god and preserve his sanity was made by Thanatos. Thanatos is the ruler of Tartarus and Erebus. He is usually called the only king of the underworld. After telling the story about the local gentleman, they arrived at his temple. Looking around at the condemned twilight god, the executioner named Yol asked him not to keep the ruler waiting. Together they went to meet the master. Flying past his domain, the gloomy god could see the places of punishment of sinners, among which there was hellfire. As its opposite, an icy hell was also located here for other clients. Other deities, who were very different from ordinary people, were limited by magical artifacts, which is why their fate was to remain eternally inside the wasteland. Noticing this, Li Changsung asked who the gods were, noting that their level was completely different from the others. Executioner Yule explained that before those prisoners became vile gods, they were considered gods of battle. These poor souls are also known as fallen stars. The fact is that Lord Tathanos judges not only the sins of the dead, but also seals away demons and evil spirits. Even though Li Changsung was a shadow god, he replied that he had never heard of it before. The executioner explained this by saying that these things should not be talked about, because this could damage their reputation in heaven. Those sinners who were less guilty than others were sentenced to menial labor as punishment. At the same time, having examined the possessions of the ruler, the condemned god and his executioner reached the meeting place with the master. Finding himself in front of the huge door to the chambers of the Supreme Being, the man asked the prisoner to prepare and behave appropriately. Turning to the door, he introduced himself as a first-class executioner Yol and reported the successful completion of the task regarding the shadow god. The door began to open and an intangible infinity appeared behind it. Through this distance, a majestic voice sounded, allowing the guests to enter inside. The expression on the gloomy god's face immediately changed. Even the system itself informed him that the atmosphere inside was extremely tense. As he walked inside, he noticed a pair of eyes watching him from the darkness. Stepping forward, the abyss began to swallow him and he began to fly. Realizing the danger of the local lord, Li Chan's son suggested with a smile that interesting events awaited him. Spatial magic transported the guy to the domain of the ruler. Having looked around, he remained on guard, since he did not know what to expect from a deity that was much higher than him in terms of hierarchy. Looking arrogantly at the prisoner, Thanatos became convinced that this was indeed a gloomy god. With a smile on his face, the first thing he did was ask if Chan's son knew where he would end up after death if he remained on Earth. Sighing heavily, the guy replied that he had no idea, since he had never thought about it before. Briefly and clearly, the man replied that the guy would have ended up in hell. Not understanding why this would be his end, Li Chansung asked to clarify the reason. With a calm face, the man began to narrate the guy's sins, starting from his days as a professional gamer. At that sinful moment, he yelled madly at his teammate because of a minor mistake, and the poor fellow took these words so close to his heart that he began to cry. Having mentioned this sin, Thanatos asked Yol what the punishment for that incident should be. The man replied that for such a sin, they practiced tearing out the tongue for 15 days. The next minor sin in the guy's opinion was his refusal to help old friends when he was too passionate about the game. For this, he was subject to torture with knives on the hellish mountain of the underworld. The list continued. Among the most petty sins was killing an ant, blaming a dog and other things for which he was sentenced to spend time with poisonous snakes and continue to have his tongue pulled out. Li Chang was simply confused by how vindictive the gods turned out to be, who are responsible for what is happening on Earth. After mentioning that he had never held a girl's hand, the guy's patience was at its limit, and he shouted with a confident look that he did not want to take part in such pathetic games with a list of nonsense. Executioner Yol and his lord Thanatos felt the wrath of the fallen god, but this did not affect their emotions in any way. Having finished the satirical story, the man clarified that these were jokes, since Li Chan's son lived an ordinary life on Earth. On the other hand, when it came to his life on Arcadia, everything was different. Not to be idle, Thanatos opened the scroll that his high-ranking executioner had brought. The guy's sins were obvious. He destroyed countless gods that were equal to him in status. Not understanding the meaning of what was happening, Li Chan's son directly asked the Lord for what reason he saved him from imminent death. As it turns out, this god wanted his fallen colleague to do important work for him. The fact is that Thanatos was deeply concerned about some gods who, despite their promises, broke their oaths and reached people. He wanted the gloomy god to go in his place to the earthly world and turn the infidels into his subjects with the help of power and authority. Hearing Thanatos' demands, the shadowy god assumed that they were going to revive him. The lord of the underworld agreed with his words, but clarified that it would be more correct to say that he would simply return him to where he should be. Possessing incredible power, he threw his hand to the side, and the boundlessness of the universe appeared in the air. These were the domains of the ruler, among which there were many galaxies and individual planets. As this power unfolded, the focus began to change, and the surprised guy saw something he had not thought about for a long time. He saw his home planet Earth, where he was born and raised before becoming one of the gods. Thanatos was attentive to his emotions and noticed that until that moment, he considered the shadowy god devoid of human emotions. Hearing the words of the highest god in the hierarchy, the guy pulled himself together and stopped showing surprise, saying that he simply hadn't seen his home for a long time. With anticipation, the man replied that Li Chan's son will be amazed when he sees with his own eyes what happens next. After these words, the bishop continued his presentation. The Earth began to approach. It was clear that the events took place in Asia. The Lord enlarged the picture even more, bringing us closer to Korea. As it turns out, it didn't just show events somewhere in Korea. It was definitely the city where Li Chan's son was born. At that moment, we were transported to one of the streets of the city at night. A guy in a purple hoodie was walking at a lamp-lit road crossing with a bottle of beer in his hand. Worried, Li Chan's son understood what was happening. He saw himself from the past. Having incredible abilities as a god, he was simply shocked by the superiority of the Thanatos system. The calm man said that he was clarifying this for a reason. He was going to send the punished guy to the time and place that he showed him. Clarifying the task, he emphasized that the shadow god should focus on sealing the gods instead of his ordinary human life. This was precisely the proposal for which he pulled Li Chan's son out of Arcadia. The conditions seemed quite possible, but expecting a catch, the guy still decided to clarify why Thanatos himself was giving such an opportunity to him, the accused shadowy god. The man on the throne replied that this was obvious, since the shadow god was considered one of the best hunters in his class. These were not words out of thin air at all. He listened to the opinions of the peoples of Arcadia, Ahura, Deba, and other civilizations with which he maintained contact as the lord of the jurisdiction. He continued with the rationale for the need for the mission of the gloomy god. The fact is that the rupture of the dungeon through which the guy once passed was the action of the gods who took up arms against the general rules. After this explanation, Li Chan's son was fully aware of the meaning of the so-called oath violation, and assumed that those insolent people wanted to take planet Earth into their possession. He turned out to be right, because the enemies really targeted his homeland, while they still slowly continued to approach their goal. In order not to miss the details, Li Chang asked why the warriors of the underworld decided not to personally deal with this problem. As it turns out, the overlord's charges are fully aware that their enemies are exploiting loopholes in the oath that prevent them from interfering. They have neither reason nor desire to act. But if a person from planet Earth intervenes in these matters, then history will take on a completely different character, because this was not mentioned in the oath. Realizing the Lord's plan, a sly grin appeared on the guy's face. He decided that Thanatos wanted to make him his own hunting dog, but did not know what would happen next. So he assumed that after the end of this story, they would say goodbye to him and complete the ritual of punishment. But the Lord had a completely different view of the situation and called it not a hunt, but correctional work, after which he would have the right to remove the shackles from Li Chan's son and give him a new life, despite his sinful past. Taking another look at his restraints, the guy realized that this was a very profitable offer. With his hands folded in front of him in a businesslike manner with a piercing gaze, Lord Thanatos stated that if the gloomy god doubts the profitability of the offer, then they can make a deal, which, depending on the guy's position, cannot make his situation even worse. Stretching his hand forward and smiling sweetly, he asked his dear guest not to worry and promised that he would reward him. Not understanding what they were talking about, the guy asked how he would like to thank him. The man slyly replied that he had power at his disposal, which would interest the former gloomy god. Despite the sincerity of the Lord's words, Li Chan's son was extremely cautious and asked if Thanatos was sure that he could simply throw away his power like that, since this was contrary to the laws of the lower world. Although the guy chose the right words, in response the Lord leaned on his hand and imperiously said that he was the sole ruler of the underworld, so there was no need to worry about it. He invited the former god to perceive his deal as the generosity of the monarch and asked if he was ready to conclude a contract. The guy's smile spoke of his positive attitude. He stated that if he is offered power, then he cannot find any reason to refuse. With a satisfied smile and a sharp rise from the throne, the Lord of the Underworld declared that in this case, the deal would come into effect. Having concluded a contract with the shadowy god, he announced the beginning of his reincarnation under the guise of returning to his home planet. All the gates of rebirth began to gradually open, and, satisfied with the results of the negotiations, Li Chan's son went out. Descending the river of the underworld, the executioner decided to give some advice before saying goodbye to the gloomy god. Yol asked the guy to remember that he was returning as a human, so he would have to face some difficulties and start his path all over again, without all the abilities and experience that he managed to gain during his life as a shadow god. Happy to be left with his own sanity, Li Chansung confirmed that he understands the full weight of responsibility. The top-ranking executioner also decided to remind that Li Chan's soul, as before, will be sealed with divine restrictive steel, but it will be activated again if something suspicious is discovered. Despite the positive aspects of the future task, the guy was still not in the mood due to the fact that he would not be able to use his power as he wished. The advice was exhausted just as they arrived at the outer gate, where it was time for farewell. It was a huge golden gate, on which was depicted a symbol of the balance of yin and yang. Without any doubt, Li Chansung jumped towards the exit from the underworld to continue his existence as a human. Before leaving this place, he decided to stop to say goodbye to his saviors properly. He turned to his executioner and thanked him for accompanying him, after which he expressed the hope that they would be able to see each other again under more pleasant conditions. With a pleasant smile on his face, he put his hand to his heart and politely replied that he would eagerly await the return of his lord's new friend. As he watched the guy go, he wished him strength and wisdom. After these parting words, the man mysteriously called Li Chan's son, the executioner, who received the power of the king of the underworld. Overcoming the distance, the gloomy god moved greatly away from the underworld and began to receive messages from the system. While in free flight, he learned that he had successfully passed through the gate of rebirth, due to which his status began to resume. The guy enjoyed freedom while his system began to be updated and reconfigured to the new server that provided the structure of planet Earth. His rights are finally back to administrator level. Li Chan's son didn't even notice how his flight was interrupted, and he ended up on his home planet. He found himself in a very crowded place. The guy lying on the grass did not raise questions among those around him, because they were also very puzzled by what was happening around him. Looking at the bright sky above him, the guy noticed a message from the system, which spoke about the acquisition of a new achievement, which was associated with his memory preservation. Thanks to this, he gained an additional 5 points for each characteristic. Excited people began to panic. They did not understand what was happening, as they found themselves at a gate that they had never heard of before. After looking around, the guy began to recognize the familiar appearance and speech of the people around him. The black hair of strangers and the Korean language from everywhere spoke only of one thing, that the gloomy god had finally returned home. Satisfied with this event, the guy crossed his arms, enjoying this pleasant atmosphere. Despite the pleasant memories that filled his mind, he still found the strength not to be distracted and focus on the goal. A moment later, he rose to his feet in order to assess the situation and begin his task. Onlookers around him tried to gather in small groups in order to find out more information about the place where they found themselves. They were all inside some kind of fenced circle that was surrounded by trees and wildlife. Assessing the situation, the guy began to understand the words that the bishop spoke to him. Thanatos mentioned that the place where Lee Chan's son will open his eyes after rebirth is Earth, but at the same time it is not it. It was clear that it would be a difficult task for the shadow god to connect with another place without catching the eye of the gods of another world. These thoughts made him think that he was not quite back home, and that he still had a lot to learn about his mission. Before saying goodbye, the Lord mysteriously called it some kind of dungeon in a random gap. Ordinary earthlings could only hear about this from the internet, reading manga. They could not imagine that they would find themselves in a place where there would be no cellular communications and the infrastructure they were accustomed to. Within a moment, they began to be surprised by messages from the air, unusual for an ordinary person. The system reported that this was a sudden dungeon called Rosewood Forest, in which there were 431 participants. Within a moment, an error related to the appearance of an undetected participant was reported. It was probably about the rebirth of Lee Chan's son. The system corrected the error in a matter of seconds and updated the list of participants. With the next message, the system announced the start of the test, specifying that the appropriate level of mission difficulty had been selected in order to adequately judge the individual strength of those present. The theme of the mission was defined as restoration. The forest was divided into 5 parts. The main mission was to destroy the monsters of the dungeon and climb to the top of the hill on the other side of the location. Among the messages was a warning that the monsters and the required restoration methods differ in different parts of the forest. All present participants gained access to their individual inventory, status window, and skill window in order to cope with the mission. While the majority succumbed to panic, among those present there were those who began to quickly adapt and prepare for the test. Among them was the gloomy god, whose experience was on a completely different level. As soon as the first part was opened, Lee Chan's son ran towards the forest. While everyone was panicking about the danger of an unknown place, he did not pay attention to it and ran towards the goal. The frightened guys could only look at his back. To them, he looked very strange. Thoughts began to cross their minds that he might be familiar with this place and the origin of this phenomenon. Speculation only raised more questions in their minds, but it was clear that if he survived, he would be the most reliable member worth working with. After running a short distance, the gloomy god began to notice the differences between the new body and the one he had previously possessed. Early shortness of breath gave him the idea that he should first understand the state of his body. After opening the system, he saw that he was able to retain his divine name as a shadow god, but the characteristics remained uncertain. The guy really expected that there would be a mess waiting for him inside the system, but he could not understand where the things that were provided to him according to the promise of the king of the underworld were. After a few seconds, the system was updated. His characteristics as a shadow god were lost, but in return he gained power, the skills of which were soul extraction and the execution sword of beginner levels. A skill called soul extortion was described as being able to extract the karma of the souls of slain enemies by burning them in the fires of purgatory. The king of the underworld was known to be highly respected due to his strength, his ability to extract souls, giving some of his power to the owner and even allowing him to use the abilities of the Lord himself. Having caught the monster, Lee Chan's son will be able to extract its soul in order to gain more experience. When faced with many monsters, he would be able to avoid losing the agility of receiving wounds. If he needs information, he can call upon souls to receive answers based on their experience. Another ability was the previously mentioned Overlord Execution Sword. which carries out divine punishment against criminals who break their oath. With its help, the executioner gains rights to part of the criminal's power, using the effects of divine punishment and extracting the power of the defendant. It is worth mentioning that abilities such as power are divine power, so if its owner uses an item like the Sword of Execution to seal the gods, then he, like the Overlord, has the power to take away the skills of others. Based on this, Lee Chan-sung admitted that in theory, he could even take an infinite amount of power and even become omnipotent, placing himself above any deity. Upon learning of his new power, Lee Chan-sung even sweated a little with excitement. He was glad that he had not been deceived. Realizing the generosity of the king of the underworld, it was obvious that he was doing this for a reason, so it was logical to assume that Thanatos was really angry with the gods of another world, if he had already given such undeniable power into the hands of a murderer. Considering his low level of strength, the gloomy god was sure that the Sword of Execution was still beyond his control, because without experience in battles, it was simply impossible to use such abilities. Speaking about abilities separately, he decided that the Execution Sword was still superior to Soul Extraction, but everything was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. It was obvious that the demands were too high, and his first serious opponent should be the one who broke the oath. Even if his enemies are these criminals, if he fails to destroy them properly, he will most likely suffer himself. Because of this, he decided to leave the Netherworld God's item sealed so he could focus on developing his own powers. Until he gained strength, he decided to only improve his characteristics. A moment after becoming familiar with the system, he ran deep into the forest where he was spotted by a monster called a black mamba. The huge monster immediately attacked the only daredevil who decided to fight inside the dungeon. The battle began. The guy was ready to become stronger in no time. He had a rusty beginner dagger at his disposal, which was more than enough for a participant with such incredible experience from the past. Thanks to his muscle memory, he instantly rushed to the attack, and with one attack was able to get rid of the enemy. Even a bad weapon in the hands of a true master is deadly, and the gloomy god proved this in the battle with the first monster on his way. After successfully destroying the novice monster with just one blow, the guy began to receive messages about learning the novice technique and gaining a new level, with which his strength and agility increased. Moreover, the success of the most active participant in the dungeon attracted the attention of a divine being, who began to closely monitor the actions of Lee Chan-sung. The confident guy decided that his immediate goal was to become a beginner, which would make his enemies tremble with fear. Returning to the fact of the existence of dungeons, it is worth noting that people even treat disasters as if they were new opportunities. This also applies to deities, because they use missions to select candidates for priests and priests. In addition, the best candidates are given the chance to become divine apostles to represent their master and faithfully carry out his will. Many people in need of the power of higher beings, thanks to fate, ended up in the dungeon. Despite their faith and desires, not all were able to cope with such ambitions, and most of them died while the gods and stars did not pay attention to them. The harmful gods and stars do not care at all about the pitiful creatures dying a natural death for them, which was the usual order of affairs. Only a few can meet their requirements. They will attract attention if they can show that they have incredible talent and the ability to overcome. Seeing a message that a constellation called a great season for hunting was watching his actions with interest, Lee Chang-sung decided that he had won the jackpot with his daring actions. He already knew who he was talking about, and the real name of this deity was Pabalsag. She is known to be the goddess of war, enjoying hunting and all manner of killing weapons. Despite her high status, by jackpot Chan-sung did not mean her, but her mother Tiamat, who is known as the original evil dragon. Looking at the bloody murder weapon, the guy was surprised with an anticipatory grin that he had already managed to interest such a large fish. He believed that Pabalsag was happy to observe his dagger technique, which is difficult to see among dungeon newcomers. The next message from the system was that the constellation was interested in what other hunting techniques the promising player could demonstrate. Having learned about this, the guy decided that he would satisfy the interest of the deity of war and show her what she wanted. Moving further through the forest, Lee Chang-sung felt a strange smell that was spreading in that place. The first half of the forest was filled with toxic air, so I came to the conclusion that most likely most of the monsters were poisonous too. After thinking about his actions, he decided to proceed with Plan C. At the same moment, two monsters of the same species as the Black Mamba attacked him simultaneously. To get a good start, the guy decided to start with snake hunter techniques, because it was the best he could use against such an opponent. Using a low-ranking dagger technique, he once again got rid of weak enemies who trembled at the mere sight of his past guise as a shadow god. Thanks to a successful attack, he again earned experience points. The system continued to notify him of success rewards every time he got rid of an opponent. As a result, in such a short period of time, he managed to once again increase his level and update his characteristics, gradually improving the parameters of his body. The sight of the newcomer's incredible superiority clearly attracted the deity. The system displayed a warning that the guy was destroying the inhabitants of the front part of the forest at high speed. Thanks to constant battles with black mambas, the blade of the low-ranking dagger began to become sharper. Constant levitation improved concentration parameters in battle. The guy's body began to reach a new level. Looking back, Lee Chan-sung began to notice that the local monsters had changed their behavior. The system reported that the black mambas began to perceive him as their natural enemy, which instinctively instilled fear in them. At that moment, protection from monsters turned into a real hunt. Light hunting gave the guy the title of Executioner of Black Mambas. Thanks to killing hundreds of monsters, he was able to gain an additional 5 points of strength and the passive skill of instilling fear in snake-like monsters. Enjoying the battle, the gloomy god decided to continue getting rid of enemies in order to sharpen his dagger even more. He could only experience such awe and excitement in battle. Remembering his life before losing his status as a shadow god, he thought that on Arcadia, the feeling of battle aroused fear in him, but despite it, he also enjoyed it at the same time. He admitted that because of the divine restraining steel, everything went wrong and he was captured, believing that he was only bringing harm to the world. He was extremely angry about this and believed that this was not the real reason, but only a cowardly excuse from those who feared his power. In his opinion, the gods were simply afraid that some pathetic mortal from planet Earth might surpass them over time. At first, he had no such intentions, but due to recent events, his view of the world began to change. Everything changed. Lee Chan-sung was ready to become the one whom the cowardly gods were so afraid of seeing that they deprived him of his divine status. After destroying countless monsters, the fallen shadow god had obtained the highest level of low-rank dagger technique. Thanks to this, he gained a mid-rank dagger technique skill, and the divine constellation began to tremble with his exceptional weapon skills. Having opened the system, he said out loud that it was too early to be surprised, since he had not yet shown everything he was capable of. The system began to inform him that his stamina was at its limit. Due to the exhaustion of his body, he received an offer to move to a safe zone in order to rest. But the guy had something completely different on his mind. He activated a skill of his power called Soul Extraction in order to gain all the experience of the monsters killed in battle. As he absorbed the power, he turned to another skill of this Pit Lord ability. Thanks to the activation of the Fire of Purgatory, he was able to successfully obtain the remains of the Black Mambas and restore 5 stamina points. Thanks to this, the message about body exhaustion disappeared, and Lee Chung decided to continue the battle. The guy's behavior turned out to be extremely unusual for a deity. He was puzzled by what system the ability of a talented mortal warrior belonged to. Messages from the system continued to surface, emphasizing that the constellation was showing interest in explaining the adventures of a force unknown to it. The guy thought that the goddess Pabal Sag would never guess that the newcomer, who had recently entered the dungeon, received a blessing from the king of the underworld himself. He decided that the constellation watching him was thinking about the abilities and attributes that players receive upon awakening. Even if Pabal Sag was very inquisitive, he understood that she would not do anything towards the dubious guy due to the limitations of the principle of causality that were installed in the system. He believed that no one was so crazy that he would violate the principle just to see the data of an ordinary beginner. Continuing to fight, the guy noticed that his level, statistics, and skills were steadily growing depending on the number of defeated monsters. He was not worried about Pabal Sag's interest, since he believed that the data protection system of the afterlife was quite reliable, because if not for it, then the information of his status window would have been revealed long ago. Opening the system window, he immediately received several messages about the destruction of monsters. Having killed the last black mamba in the location, he received a new achievement as a snake hunter, thanks to which he was able to gain additional power points and low-rank resistance to poison. Looking at his data, he noticed that his level and other parameters continued to rise steadily. Thanks to his achievements, he has earned points of magical power, so he should think about how to use the acquired skills. The system reported that the player should earn the favor of a god who was interested in his actions. This was good news. Having finished with the black mambas, he decided that red and bloody snakes were next in line. Thanks to his low-rank achievement, he gained a weak immunity to poison, which in theory should make his battles with new enemies easier. Turning to location data, it is worth mentioning that the bloody mamba is considered the main one in the forest. It controls the rest of the monsters of its type. While it seemed that it was impossible for a beginner who had not reached level 10 to defeat her, but despite this, Chan Sung was thinking about destroying the boss alone. This was a great opportunity, and the guy thought that this way he could attract the attention of the gods. A more important reward will be a trophy. The poisonous fang of the bloody mamba is known as an item that helps to quickly gain immunity from poison. It is worth mentioning that one of the reasons why the shadow god lost the war was because his enemies were outnumbered, and also the fact that he was hopelessly weak against curses and poisons. Angrily remembering the curses, he thought that he needed the fang of the bloody mamba in order to gain immunity. Within a moment, he noticed how his weapon began to collapse. At the same moment, he received a message that the rusty dagger for beginners had expired. Sighing, he was surprised that despite the number of monsters destroyed, this item could last so long. While thinking about where to get a new weapon, he heard a whistle from the sky from an object that was rapidly flying towards him. An object fell next to him that looked like a weapon. Taking a closer look, he noticed the image of a dragon and realized that this was a weapon from the goddess Tiamat. He couldn't believe that the goddess had decided to sacrifice one of her items for the fun of observing the actions of a mortal warrior inside a low-ranking dungeon. After the weapon appeared, the system reported that the constellation presented him with this gift in order to make a bet with him. The conditions stated that if the guy loses in the boss fight, then the goddess interested in him will take the gift and kill him. Looking at the daring appeal, it became clear to him that this was a challenge, because the deity from the very beginning began to talk about his death if he lost. It is obvious that the constellation only thinks about itself, while ordinary players are just entertainment for them. Because of this phenomenon, Li Chang-sung, as a person, having learned the essence of higher beings, sincerely hated the gods. But despite their arrogance, this time such behavior was to his advantage, because if he played the situation correctly, he would win. If he obtains the dagger of the goddess Tiamat, it will greatly affect his future battles. The bet was accepted. The system reported that the deity was laughing, as he really liked the courage shown on the part of the player. A sudden task was created with bet conditions. Meanwhile, movement began inside the ring of the beginning of the dungeon. A man began asking everyone to gather, which caused indignation onlookers. They were clearly unhappy that he began to pretend to be in charge. The loud man standing in front of them introduced himself as Second Lieutenant Park Hae-sung, a C-rank player from the Awoken Squad under the command of Military Defense Support. He said that in case of an emergency, everyone should follow his instructions. Hearing his words, the guys breathed a sigh of relief, as they were glad to know that at least one player was among them. On the other hand, they remembered that stranger who ran into the forest alone the moment the dungeon mission appeared. They sincerely hoped that nothing bad had happened to him. Looking into the forest, they assumed that he ran in a particular direction, because he thought he would get lucky. Despite the heated discussion on the part of the young participants, a girl was sitting under one of the trees in no mood and was not even going to join the discussion. One of the guys replied that he did not agree with the majority opinion. He believed that the stranger must have a huge amount of money if he was so confident in his own strength. He confidently said that they saw the one called Tyrant, the leader of the ST team. The guys remembered him because of his name. One of the guys said that thanks to his appearance, Tyrant starred in many advertisements, even though as a person he was considered a very unpleasant person. There were rumors that he was the one who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Those who were aware of his success could not understand why he then went into the dungeon. The all-knowing guy shared rumors that, in fact, Tyrant abandoned esports and became an alcoholic, which is probably why he began to experience a lack of money. Another option he considered was his difficult moral state. He believed that having lost everything, the tyrant decided to say goodbye to life inside one of the dungeons. After his daring words, his friend joined the conversation. He warned everyone that the guy in the blue jacket was drunk and could not control his speech. A moment later, all participants began to receive messages from the system that all the Black Mambas had been defeated. The participants were shocked by such information, because they had not seen anyone who would be capable of such a feat in such a short period of time. One observant girl noticed that all the participants were in the safe zone from the very beginning, so she did not understand who was able to eliminate the novice monsters of the dungeon. The following messages surprised even an experienced player. He learned that the monster called the White Worm and all the Blue Crows had been eliminated. In addition, he was alerted by a message about the destruction of a boss called the Red Mamba. After this, the system reported that the player Lee Chan-sung became a berserker. At that moment, it became clear who exactly was behind the events. Onlookers could not understand how this could be possible. The words of the guy in the blue jacket turned out to be ridiculous rumors, and he was very angry as he had deceived everyone present. Meanwhile, Lee Chan-sung was among the destroyed enemies. Thanks to the new weapons, dealing with them was not a problem. He began extracting the souls of monsters in order to gain enough experience. Having fulfilled the terms of the bet, he received a message from the system that the constellation deity was interested in finding new apostles and priests who would promote her faith. All the decent priest roles were already taken, but despite this, Pabalsag found a good offer. She saw the guy as a candidate for the apostles of her personal army. The system warned the guy that he could not be accepted so easily, because first, he had to pass a test. He had 24 hours to destroy the bloody mamba with a temporary dagger. The condition stated that if successful, he would receive the tooth of an evil dragon and the opportunity to join the selection for apostles. For the guy, this was not surprising, because he understood that the goddess was very interested in his abilities from the very beginning. It looks like he had an emergency. He remembered that there had previously been a big conflict between the goddess Tiamat and Marduk, so it was logical to assume that this was somehow connected. It is worth mentioning that Bel Marduk is the strongest zodiac sign among the 12 constellations. It is known as Taurus. The task was not easy, but he was sure that if this was true, then he would be able to significantly improve his level and obtain very valuable items. Looking at the gift dagger, he noticed that it was an unusual weapon. It was known that in order to protect her child, the original evil dragon created a dagger from her fang with its own character. The category of the dagger classified it as a sacred weapon. The power of the attack was impossible to determine. Since he had borrowed this sacred item, he could not use all of its original capabilities until he had it completely at his disposal. This was what was needed, but the greed of the shadowy god forced him to offer the deity another bet. The divine being was at a loss, and in order not to waste time, the guy clarified that he was proposing to set the time frame for the mission at 30 minutes. Pabalsag was shocked by this proposal. The young man seemed too self-confident. Lee Chang-sung clarified the details and said that he would kill the bloody mamba in 30 minutes and give the constellation a great show in the form of a mesmerizing battle. In exchange, he asked for the best reward from the one specified in the bet. The guy's audacity delighted the deity, and Pabalsag accepted the terms of the new deal. She also added to the conditions that in case of loss, the end of the participant's life would be painful. Having heard from the system about the positive response of the interested deity, the guy went on a mission. He quickly reached the huge monster, which was the strongest among the snakes, with whom he had fought earlier. This snake did not feel a sense of fear towards the player like less powerful snakes did. She immediately struck. Thanks to his incredible agility, Lee Chan-sung dodged in an instant and was able to climb onto the body of a huge monster. As he moved forward towards his goal, he was eager to test the power of his new weapon. Having reached a convenient part of the enemy's body, he took out his gift dagger. The power of this weapon was more than enough to penetrate the bloody mamba's strong defenses. Despite the low level, the guy continued to destroy the body of the enemy monster. Having destroyed this monster in a matter of seconds, Lee Chan received a message from the system that he had gained a new level. In addition, His strength had increased by 3 points. After successfully destroying the snake, he saw flying lizards appear behind him and rush towards him. Switching to a new opponent, the guy easily dealt with the first of them. The system began to report an increase in agility, and that rumors of his bet with the deity began to spread at incredible speed. As a result of his actions, not only Pabalsag, but also several other gods were surprised by the performance. Some of them were interested in finding out how the newcomer had such incredible combat experience. The excitement of the battle brought the guy pleasure, and moreover, he managed to attract even more attention, thanks to which he would be able to get precious items. With a smile on his face, Li Chang thought that the more gods that were interested in his power, the better it would be. In this case, he could count on more rapid development of his own abilities. Meanwhile, Pabilsag was surprised by the number of unexpected guests, and the system reported that she was persistently warning the other gods that the young man belonged to her. Approaching the new monster, the guy continued to receive messages about leveling up. He hoped that among those watching his performance there would be those who would generously reward his courage and strength. At the moment before the collision with the bloody Mamba, he received a message about gaining the 10th level. Since he had already passed the beginner level, he was given a secret class for completing this task in the shortest time. Moreover, his statistics increased by 5 points in all parameters. Analyzing the situation, Li Chang thought that in his previous life he had the spearman class, but this time he does not have the opportunity to choose a regular level. It would be great for him to become the King of Dragons or the King of Darkness, but he knew that it would be really difficult. As we heard earlier, he decided that in this case, the best option would be the power of the Berserker. He believed that Berserkers had great attack power, but they lacked common sense. Despite this, he was willing to avoid the ability's side effects with extra precautions. In order to win such an absurd bet, he decided that the unimaginable strength of a berserker would be his best choice. With a sly smile on his face, he planned to use this ability to compensate for his low level, because he knew that even players at level 20 would find it difficult to kill a monster of that level. Opening the interface, he began to choose among the possible options. He began to shiver because after looking through 30 choices, he still could not find the Berserker class. Continuing to scroll through the system interface, the guy could not find the power he needed to complete the bet. Time was running out. He had only 6 minutes to escape. The final monster was already nearby, and it was a matter of time before he noticed the player. Li Chang's son agreed to such a daring bet, but miscalculated because he could not find the required ability in the list. Meanwhile, the divine being had already begun to wonder how the player would cope in the remaining time. The 3 unknown gods also continued to watch. They were impatient to know Li Chang's choice of ability. The guy had only one way out of the situation. It was to change the plan. Looking at the list, the only thing he liked was the secret skill of the Rune Keeper. He was annoyed by the fact that he would have to draw runes every time he wanted to use this power, but he was attracted to the destructive power because it was superior to a berserker in some situations. Moreover, this skill could probably help him compensate for his lack of combat effectiveness. A determined guy on the verge of failure decided to choose a Rune Keeper as his main class. His agility instantly increased and magical power appeared, which he did not possess. Among the statistics, new items have appeared, such as intelligence and will. The system also reported that the skill of creating runes of the lowest rank, as well as engraving runes, had been acquired. Starting to get used to the new ability, the system continued to report what the reaction of the deities that were observing him was. The divine being who was trying to gain the guy's power was simply shocked by his choice, while the rest of the observers simply began to laugh. Despite the reactions of observers, Li Chang-sung was satisfied with his choice. Looking at the statistics, he confirmed his suspicions that 2 rune skills appear first. For him, this was more than enough to win, but he had to hurry, because there were about 4 minutes left before the end of the bet. After using the new ability for the first time, his statistics began to update. As a result of this, an additional 25 points were added to his intellect and will parameter. Meanwhile, the main monster of this location had already noticed the presence of the stranger. The player remained careful, because one blow from the bloody Mamba could end their fight. Within a moment, Li Chan was discovered and a huge monster rushed towards him. Being in a disadvantageous position, the guy decided to change the location to a more suitable one, taking out a gift dagger in advance. Having dodged the first blow of the monster, it became clear that at that moment he could say goodbye to his life. Having gained some time, the player activated the skill of creating runes of the lowest rank. The system reported that the chance of success will be increased proportionally to the growth of the player's statistics. Holding his sword in front of him, the guy prepared for battle. First of all, he gave himself a small cut in order to use his new abilities. Thanks to the blood, he managed to stain his sword to fulfill the conditions for creating runes. In fact, he never thought that he would have to fight such a strong monster at a low level, so the skill he forcibly learned was just right for him. By drawing blood on the sword, rune engraving was activated, with which he could greatly enhance the power of his weapon. The system reported that the player had successfully engraved the explosion rune on his dagger, and preparations for battle had been completed. Despite the enhancement, the bloody mamba's skin proved to be too durable, causing the divine being to mock the player's actions. Although the guy was unable to damage the monster's body the first time, Pablsag began to show interest in the newcomer's knowledge of runic symbols. While using the skill, the guy successfully engraved all the runes thanks to his concentration and will, for which he was rewarded with an increase in the level of his ability. Although he was rewarded with a 5-fold increase in the explosion rune for a minute, the magical power was already spent, and the player fell into wild hunger. By the end of the battle, there were only 3 minutes left, and the blood mamba's body had still not been damaged. But Li Chan's son did not give up, because he believed that this time would be more than enough. Another powerful explosion from the use of the ability spread throughout the forest, and the dungeon recruits could not help but notice it. Even the experienced lieutenant was excited by what was happening. He thought that incessant sounds of an explosion of unknown origin were coming from the forest, which were gradually becoming stronger than the previous ones. Powerful explosions began to panic the newcomers, and they began to loudly discuss what was happening without their participation. Within a moment, they received a message from the system, which satisfied their interest. They learned that player Li Chan-sung had launched a raid on the boss alone. Upon learning that we were talking about a bloody mamba, they were shocked. Such an early raid on the boss raised no less a question than the presence of the name of a known e-sportsman with a bad reputation. One of the enraged guys decided to sow panic and shouted that Li Chan was trying to drag them down with him, provoking one of the strongest monsters in the dungeon. Angrily remembering the past, he noticed that Li Chang behaved in the same way at matches. He headlong did only what he wanted, without thinking about the rest of the team. After these words, the restless guy turned to the soldier with a request to do at least something. But the young guy's panic did not affect the experienced fighter in any way. He recalled his words that they should stay in their places. He believed that if they disrupted the formation even slightly, then the death of all participants would be inevitable. The excited guy was ready to say goodbye to life. He began to curse the one who went to fight the boss alone. Meanwhile, a more reasonable and experienced fighter began to analyze the situation. Looking at the light above the forest, he decided that it was associated with decisive blows. Without understanding the origin of such power, it became obvious to him that Li Chang's skills were beyond his imagination. At that moment, the thought occurred to him that they still had a chance of survival. Under the illumination of a power of unknown origin, he could only guess what was happening on the battlefield. The explosions continued, the battle was in full swing, and the time for the bet was running out. During the battle, the gloomy god became so immersed in the use of power unimaginable for the participants that he began to lose his human appearance. In order not to lose his own life, he put everything he could into each explosion. After another powerful explosion, the long-awaited calm began. Participants in the dungeon began to receive messages from the system that they had successfully completed the hunt for the first boss called the Bloody Mamba. The worried soldier breathed a sigh of relief. Thanks to the efforts of just one player, their group managed to clear the first zone of their mission. After completing the task, Li Chan's son was able to take first place in the dungeon rankings, collecting the maximum 5,000 points. The system said that rewards will be given according to achievements. After seeing such an incredible fight, the lieutenant decided that there was a possibility that he was witnessing the birth of a new member of the 10 Kings. When the guys began to slowly move towards the outskirts of the gate, the main boss suddenly appeared from the forest. The frightened players could not believe their eyes because just recently they had seen a message that the bloody Mamba had been defeated. The terrifying gaze of the monster, which required at least level 20 for a fair battle, terrified everyone who was closer to the forest. Of course, at that moment, the guy in the blue jacket and his comrade began to say goodbye to life. They probably cursed Li Changsu, believing that he had somehow bypassed the system and passed off a false victory as reality. Within a moment, the body of the bloody mamba fell to the ground right in front of the frightened newcomers. As it turned out, the monster did not get inside the safe zone on its own. It was just a body that the winner brought. Those who stood behind escaped with only a slight fright. Few of them managed to see in person the guy who, at the very beginning of the dungeon, was quickly rushing into the forest. With a purposeful and cold gaze, Li Chang assumed that he had reached the safe zone where the rest of the players were. The lieutenant was the only one who had the strength to answer. He confirmed the assumption of the savior of his squad. After making sure he was in the right place, Li Chang turned to the onlookers and announced that the boss was finished. After that, he asked the players to clear the forest of weak monsters, which he left so that the rest would have a chance to survive and gain important rewards. Understanding the superior power of the strongest of the squad, the lieutenant took his words not as a request, but as an order. Being grateful for what Li Chang had done, he suggested that he rest while they set up camp. Continuing to drag the boss's huge head behind him, Li Chang refused the offer, saying that the other players would be uncomfortable being in the same company with him. The boys began to doubt whether he really was the one known as the tyrant. He seemed like a completely different person to them, and some players began to assume that a real demon had appeared in their ranks. While the others were thinking about who helped him, the lieutenant began to laugh that the danger had passed. The guy in the blue jacket was clearly not amused. He was still angry, because he could not tolerate the impudent cyber sportsman who acted alone. His anger could be seen from the emotions that he could not hide. Looking at Li Chang's son, he agreed with the opinion that this was a completely different person, and maybe even a demon. After leaving the safe zone, a smile appeared on the player's face. He was amused by the rumors that people were treating him like some kind of monster. Before opening the second part of the forest, he had enough time to rest. The guy stopped in a convenient place and threw the body of the killed monster. To begin with, he decided to try protective ways of using runes and engraved a barrier rune on the stone. Thanks to his new experience, he managed to increase the level of this skill, and the barrier worked the first time and protected his prey from other players. During the battle period, his lowest rank rune creation skill reached the maximum level, so the highest rank skills were unlocked. Separating himself from the others, Li Chang first decided to distribute the rewards. Some rewards were still in standby mode, namely rewards for winning a bet. The guy received a list, after examining which he decided that it was useless to choose prey at a low level. The fang of an evil dragon was still enough for him. At that moment, the choice seemed obvious and he settled on additional points for achievements. Thanks to this choice, he gained 15,000 karma points. With a grin on his face, he believed that he needed a thing that would unite the world of people and the kingdom of the gods. His plan was to prepare to open a store for the system he was working with. To clarify the details, he opened his interface and saw a number of updates. He reached level 15, tolerance to low-rank poison of the 5th level, and 50 units of additional statistics. The rapid development of the power level of the Lord of the Underworld was great news, thanks to which the idea of dragging the body of the bloody mamba was relevant. Looking around, the guy noticed new messages from the system. In his possession was one of the rewards from the task of overthrowing the boss. Despite his success in the bet, the divine being was reluctant to share any additional rewards with him, and the other gods changed their attitude and began to take an open interest in the identity of the mortal warrior. After the other gods showed interest in the guy, Pabalsag showed her jealousy, and once again warned the observers that if they touched what belonged to her, then they would not be able to escape the wrath of the dragon. After these words, she changed her mind and offered a second reward for winning the bet in a limited time. The list included an Anatazan gold bar, a heavenly cup, and an almighty stone. The items provided demonstrated the deity's generosity, as they were famous dragon treasures. Pabalsag shared her opinion that if her task is to meet the needs of the future apostle, then no treasure can be too much. The other gods were surprised by the generosity of this offer, and were themselves interested in ways to obtain rare items. Despite this, the guy had some cunning plan in his head, and he simply refused the reward. In response to his action, the system reported that the divine being was confused, and some gods began to question the intentions of the daring player. Due to the refusal of rewards, the system compensated them with 1 million karma points. By allowing the reward system to accumulate, Li Chang creates the opportunity to dispose of it as he pleases, regardless of the deity's decision. The impudent behavior caused the obvious displeasure of the goddess of war. Despite this, in return she invited the player to become her apostle. But the cunning Li Chan refused the offer for the second time and gained another 1 million karma points. He said out loud that first he wanted to gain more experience and also clarified that he did not plan to become a candidate.